Thank you, Joan. I just want to set the stage here by saying, be kind to me, because I am not coming from a history background. I kind of fell into this project through Far Country Press. They offered me to do this project, and I said, sure, I like to scare myself. And then I decided to scare myself again by coming here and talking to you. So don't set your expectations too high, is all I'm saying. I was trying to think of what my main theme or idea for today was going to be, and all I kept thinking about was, God, this topic is so hard. So I think that's going to be the topic for today. I went to Ellen Baumler at the beginning of my project to kind of ask for some sage advice on how to get started. She said, how long do you have? When's your deadline? I said, 6 months, and that was a year ago. And she said, that's ambitious. Good luck. But she was very gracious in helping me out and pointing me in the right direction. And I want to start out my talk today by first pointing to the idea that this is hard and talking about a madam that I didn't write about in the book. It was a dead end. But I got my hunches, and I want to talk about that a little bit. And rather than going too in-depth with a bunch of the madams that I wrote about, I picked a select few. I don't know if I'm going to make through it all today, otherwise we'd be here till 5 o'clock. And so we may stop at a certain point, and I'll say, do you want to talk, or do you want me to keep talking? So we'll kind of play it by ear. But basically what I did was I handpicked a few of the madams, and I made short bulleted lists on what I perceived their characters to be based on things that I found in my research. And I think they're spot on, but other people might disagree, but that's what it's all about. So I'm going to first talk about Annie Dillon. When I was researching the Marysville area, I was looking at a book by Jan McKell, The Red Light Women of the Rocky Mountains, and she threw down the name of Annie Dillon and kind of alluded to the idea that she was a madam without really coming out and saying it. So I think that she was not sure either. And Annie Dillon was one of the first 3 women to arrive in Marysville. She was single. She came there with her mother from Grizzly Gulch. She had a hotel that she ran in Grizzly Gulch up toward Unionville before coming to Marysville. And the Drum Lemon Hotel, Thomas Cruise, who we all know struck it rich in Marysville, had the hotel built specifically for Annie and her mother to run. That's kind of suspect to me. And continuing in my research, particularly about the Helena area, I came to find out that Thomas Cruise was in tight with the madams of Helena. He extended some no-interest loans to them. Sometime he was known to write off significant sizable loans, and women got off without having to pay him back. So, of course, I'm wondering what's going on. I want to know. But, you know, it's a struggle to find out. So then I obsessed for the longest time, much to my husband's chagrin, on this relationship between Annie Dillon and Thomas Cruise. Was she a prostitute in Grizzly Gulch that grub-staked him when he was scraping to get by before he struck it rich? Or were they lovers? We all know, she was quite a bit younger than he was, but we know that his wife, Maggie Carter, was 27 years his junior. Wow. And so he had an affinity for the fine young women. Was she an illegitimate child, or was she the child of a friend who died? The possibilities are endless. Then I started obsessing on, maybe they were connected back in Ireland and they came together on a boat. And so then I started sifting through the boat logs and trying to find all of Annie's family members with Thomas Cruise on a single ship, and then realizing that everybody from Ireland is named Mary, Margaret, Annie, Patrick. It was futile, so I gave up on that dead end. So I let the ship records go, and I sifted around some more. And then in 1882, I came across a little advertisement in the Independent Record, kind of a cryptic message. From what I could tell, it was a couple days after the big Marysville ball, and it was an ad posted by Annie and her mother. Mrs. Annie Dillon and Anne Mullaney, her mother, proprietresses of the Drum Lummin Hotel, Marysville, take this method of expressing their sincere thanks to Messrs. Cruise and Lynch of Marysville, of Messrs. Mitchell, Duffy, Negus, Jacobs, Johns, Tierney, Root, and others of the valley for the agreeable and pleasant surprise that greeted those ladies on Wednesday evening. Oh, this was driving me nuts. What is it? And then I found some other things that were suspect. 1912, I found an Anaconda Standard article that claimed that Annie was the largest valuable mining property owner among women in the West, which was a real common trait for madams to be amassing wealth through land. And she was also one of the largest property owners in Marysville. So this is the Drum Lummin Hotel. I don't know if you can see, but I'm thinking I see a few women down here and a few women up here. They could be hotel guests. They could be regular boarders of the house tending to the needs of the men in town. One might assume, not necessarily. I leave it to you. I just haven't found sufficient evidence to verify my hunch, and it's driving me nuts. So I anticipate obsessing on this once all of the Madam book stuff is out of the way and I can start focusing on this madness. One other thing to note, this is Annie Dillon's headstone in the resurrection ceremony. Notice what's a spitting distance in the background. It's Thomas Cruise's mausoleum. Say no more. But I mean, it very easily could have been a family friend. He was very kind to the people who helped him out when he was struggling before he struck gold. So it very easily could have been a platonic thing. But I'm just wanting to say that about 50% of the time that I was researching for this book was spent on this kind of stuff. So, all right. Next up, I'm going to talk about one of the more well-known madams, Eleanore Dumont, fondly known as Madame Eustache. She went by various names, and this is another thing that drove me nuts in my research, is these women switched up their names, they switched up their towns, they lied on their marriage certificates about their age, they lied on the census records. So it's difficult. Eleanore Dumont went, from what I found, various names: Simone Jules, Emmeline Dumont, Eleanore Dumont, Sarah de Villiers. And she came and established herself as a cunning card shark in San Francisco around the 1850s. And a lot of this stuff has been published over and over again, so I'm not going to dwell too much on the stuff that is pretty familiar. I'm going to focus more on things that I personally obsessed on. There is a list of some qualities that I found to be true in my research. If you can't see, it's elusive, exotic, classy, elegant, a woman of her word, eventually on the decline, restless, and then at the end, tired of life. She was exotic, and I got the sense that she really enjoyed putting herself on a pedestal and being admired by the people around her. And she had this air of mystery that she kind of fed into. She told people that she was from France, and her father was this lord who had this large estate that he lost to the Napoleon's reign of terror, and then she was given away resentfully to a man in an arranged marriage who was older than her, and she fell in love with somebody and was going to elope to Marseille, but her husband locked her away for 5 years, and then she escaped to America. But a lot of historians think she probably came from New Orleans. She was hired, like I said before, she was really good at playing cards. Her specialty was 21, which I guess was a French version of 21. Correct me if I'm wrong. But she was eventually fired because people were accusing her of card sharping. But I got the sense that that possibly might not have been the case, just because she was consistently honest throughout her life, according to various things that I found. Another highlight of how she was elegant, she left San Francisco and went to Nevada City, California, to this dusty mining town, decked out in this beautiful outfit, sauntering down the road, looking into empty shops for something, and all these miners are dirty, talking their cuss talk, and wondering what such a refined woman is doing in their neck of the woods. And they come to find out they get these invites for a classy gambling house that she decked out with gaslit chandeliers, plush carpets, felt tables, live orchestra, free champagne on the house. You have to wear a suit to come into this place. No swearing. And I'm the only lady allowed in the house. Other women were not allowed in the premises or allowed to loiter in front. And men would approach her, make advances, and she'd just say, "I am a respectable woman. Psh. Come play some cards with me." And then she wouldn't allow them to cuss around her. So she was very refined, and she, I think, got a lot of pleasure out of being that focus of attention. She initially just ran gambling houses and then got into the bordello scene, and they were high-end. And progressively, as her career went on and she spent more time in the Wild West, her gracefulness kind of spiffled out there. And she started picking up the lingo, the boys around her. And she started, she wasn't hesitant to rough somebody up if she found them to be a threat. It's smoking cigars. But she still, to a certain degree, had this desire to be on a pedestal, which was apparent. She had a place that she ran in Fort Benton. You may know it was called the Cosmopolitan on Front Street. And Front Street was a raucous place, and it was considered the bloodiest block in the West. And there, every day, somebody's torn open, beat up, cut up, whatever. There was always some action going down there. And her brothel / gambling house / saloon was not quite so nice as the plush places she had had earlier. But if you were to walk in there, according to the descriptions of the place that I found, there were gambling tables all around, but in the middle of the room was a platform with an empty card table. And if a man came in to challenge the madam of the house to a game of cards thinking he was going to clean her out, she would descend down the staircase, kind of like Donald Trump, down the escalator. And she would sit down to a game of 21 probably at this table on the platform where everybody was watching. And the guys would barely get the chance to keep their seat warm before they lost all their money. And then she would promptly serve them a glass of milk on the house and send them on their way. So there's other things about her you can read when the book comes out, if it ever comes out. But I'm going to move on just for the sake of time here. Next up, I have a woman by the name of Maddy Lee. She was a widow that came over to the West from Maine. Like many women of the day who were in the skin trade, they saw it as the only means to support themselves as single women after they found themselves without their spouse. She went by the names of Mattie DeVere and Dutch Matt and Dutch Mattie. And she found herself considerably wealthy doing the circuit of, she ran houses in Fort Benton, Elkhorn, Granite, Phillipsburg, Virginia City. And in several accounts, I determined that time was not kind to her rapidly. There was one account in a Fort Benton paper in 1883 where a reporter described her as a frail beauty. But it wasn't 7 years later when in Granite when Anaconda Standard hyperbolic reporter described her as one of the worst and most repulsive-looking creatures on the whole army of prostitutes now living in Granite. So she lived hard, she drank hard, and she got in a couple of hard situations that I'm going to describe here. You might wonder why I have the title Men for Breakfast for her. There were two instances that I describe in my book, and I'm going to explain one here. At about 3 in the morning on March 30th, 1891, in the town of Granite, Maddy Lee burst into Sam Green's saloon with a man at her heels in hot pursuit. He lunged forward and grabbed her, and the two started struggling and arguing while about 10 patrons paused mid-sentence over their drinks to watch. What led to this public squabble? A feisty round of cards, known as casino. The excitable Jack McDonald was a stranger to town. He was a ticket taker at Butte's premier variety and burlesque theater called the Comique. And he'd come to visit a sick friend. And in the meantime, he decided to pay a little visit to Maddie's house of glory, play a round of cards, and he started losing. But fortunately for Maddie, he decided to double his bet to regain his finances, and he lost. And so he wanted his money back. And Maddie said, "No way. Fair's fair." And she grabbed the money and ran out the door up to Sam's saloon, where she had some friends to hide behind. Nothing annoys a gambler more than to see his hard-earned stack of chips pulled away after a lucky break. After a few heated words, So he caught up with her in the saloon and grabbed her, and he struggled with her, and he was an ex-Butte cop. And I think that he was still in that mindset a little bit, and he was telling her, "I'm going to take you down and book you." Meanwhile, her friend Frank, what's Frank's last name? I haven't committed. Frank McKean, he is another neighboring salon owner, and he had come down after hours to partake in whatever they did after hours, and saw this scuffle, and he steps in and says, "You can't arrest my friend. You're not even a cop. You're not even a local cop." So the two of them start going at it, and Maddie's friend Frank had a gun on him, which the other gentleman was trying to grab from him, and they got in a tuffle, and they're rolling down the bar. And meanwhile, Maddie is going, "Go, go," and throwing in her sucker punches at every chance she gets. And then a few shots fire off and ricochet around the room, and then finally another shot hits the Butte man in the leg, and he drops to the floor. And if Jack had died there that night, they would have said that Sam's Saloon had a man for breakfast, which was a euphemism for someone dead on the floor. So anyway, Frank turned him, I get him mixed up, Jack. Maddie's friend turns himself into the police, He's going to get tried. Maddie pays for a top-notch lawyer to get him off the hook, and he's fine. He never has to go to jail for the scuffle. The gentleman who got shot ended up dying 2 days later after having to get his leg amputated. So he wasn't necessarily served for breakfast that night, but they waited 2 days for their breakfast. So, after all of that happened, Frank had bought Maddie a brothel in Virginia City, 150 miles away, either as a thank you or get the hell out of here. I don't want your kind of trouble here anymore. And this is the brothel that she owned in Virginia City. She ran it for about 10 years. It's called the Green Front Boarding House, which you wouldn't know based on its color now. But then she left the state for a couple years and then came back and set up shop in Phillipsburg and found herself in a strangely familiar situation. There was a local Finnish man who was a woodman nearby, in a wood camp nearby. And apparently these Finns had a reputation for being salty and mean drunks, I guess. They had a reputation in town. And he decided to come into town for a little fun and visited Maddie's house and then got sloshed and left without paying his tab and went to another bar to continue his drinking. Meanwhile, Maddie's heavily drinking, and she staggers out and goes to the neighboring bar and says, "You pay me up." And he's like, "Whatever." And so she's just totally incensed and pulls out her gun and waves it around, and a bullet goes off, ricochets on the floor, and hits him in the foot. And he's not even fazed. He's pretty numb at this point. Now, whether he's being stoic and just trying to get her goat even more, or if he's just really, really numb, remains to be seen. But because he didn't flinch, it just burned her. So she pointed the gun straight to his head, and he just stared at her and didn't even move. And she snapped. Something snapped, and she laid him out. And then she ended up with 10 years state pen in Deer Lodge. No evidence of her on the public record that I could find after that. So she had hard living. Are anybody's eyes glazing over? Am I going too slow? Okay. So if I did everything that I had prepared for, we'd be here for 3 hours. So so much has been written about Chicago Joe and discussed about her. I feel like this is the one sacrifice I can make. Is everybody okay with that? Okay. This is who I really want to talk about. Another woman who's been written a lot about. And I want to thank this woman here, Lee, for making this one of my favorite chapters in my book. Dorothy Josephine Baker, she came from Great Falls. Her name is Dorothy Putnam. Her name is Dodie. And she had the last operating brothel on the St. Louis block, which was above the Windbag Saloon, which apparently is no longer the Windbag. I guess there's a sports bar moving in there. Where have I been? I just heard that last week. So anyway, I begin my chapter by describing the abatement, the final closing of her brothel, where the officials came in and they scooped her out. Dorothy Josephine Baker, they found an ailing Dorothy Josephine Baker, a 240-pound diabetic who's clearly seen better days. She was entering into her 4th week of having a terrible flu and looking emotionally beat down, according to one reporter who had accompanied the city officials. Another less kind reporter described her as dumpy. Despite her failing health, the men escorted the feeble 57-year-old madam out of the building. She was wearing a simple house dress and left with nothing more than the coat on her back and the Coke bottle glasses on her face. All of her other remaining possessions were left inside of her living quarters. She never saw them again. The scene seemed a little too much 30-year-old Paul Lenmark, a city planner at the time, as he gazed down from a second-story window across the street. A crowd of police and sheriff vehicles surrounded Dorothy's place. It was excessive, he said. It had been a cool spring day in Helena with overcast skies, and Big Dorothy shivered outside when workmen approached the building with fresh sheets of plywood straight from the lumber yard and boarded up all the windows. I was overwhelmed, Lenmark said. She had on a dress like my grandmother would wear, and they locked her out of her home just like that. She wasn't able to get her personal stuff out, and there was no cease and desist. Paul Lenmark realized he was witnessing an end of an era that was significant for Helena. So this, what led up, many of you, yeah. That was 72, is that right? Okay, sorry, I'm not good with retaining dates very well. My brain is full. What led up to her abatement was essentially the whole urban renewal grant that she had. There were the city commission granted her $500 in federal funds for urban renewal to make communities better. She took advantage of it. She wanted to turn the downstairs level, which was eventually the Windbag, which is no longer the Windbag. She wanted to remodel it, bring it up to code, and she even had tenants to run a legitimate business down there. But when the city commission granted her the funds, people were outraged because she ran an illicit business, which was strictly against the rules and guidelines of being able to get that grant money. So the sorry, I'm skipping over some stuff here. Thomas Dowling, he was the person I was thinking of. The county attorney, basically to appease the people who were griping, said, if I can find evidence that she's running an illicit business, we'll shut her down. But until then, I can't do anything about it. So then they sent out two officers to go undercover in her establishment, and they testified that they paid the $20 to get drinks sold without a license, and paid $20 to watch some woman dancing naked around on a bed. And that was enough to shutter her doors. Now, there was total uproar in the community. Floods of letters came in to the newspapers saying how she did so much more for the community than a lot of the aldermen of Helena, and she was given to charities left and right. She donated books to children's homes. She put people through college without even telling them that she was sponsoring their education. This woman was an institution, and they're taking that away. Who else is going to stand up and fill her shoes as far as holding up this community? On the flip side, there were people who were not so excited about Dorothy and her business. One being Supreme Court Justice Harrison. And he had spent pretty much the good bulk of his career, starting when he was district attorney, trying to abate her premises. And he had a long history with Dorothy. And I was very excited when Lee turned me on to his autobiographical oral history. And he says about Dorothy, and I quote, "She was a big, tough bitch, and I would have hated like hell to have met her in a dark alley." She was an athlete in high school. She was in tumbling, volleyball, basketball. I mean, she may have been sizable, but she could poke a rib cage if she needed to. Let's talk a little bit about when Judge Harrison had been district attorney. County, huh? County attorney. Okay, thank you. County attorney. he tried filing an injunction against Big Dorothy after a doctor in the health department reported a slew of VD cases coming out of her house. And so he filed the injunction, and then he got a lot of calls from local businesses saying, "You're crazy, you can't do this." And then a couple judges called him in and said, essentially in so many words, "You're stupid for trying to take this on." And so in preparing for the case, he had a sheriff for about a month before park out in the back of her establishment and take photos. And just to get an idea of who were some of the faces coming in and out of Dorothy's place. And his reason being, they wanted to make sure they could pluck out jury people who they didn't want to have on the jury. Well, come to find out, one of the faces, well, there were quite a few familiar faces in the stack of photographs, but one in particular was a young bachelor lawyer or judge from out of town who sometimes came in to fill in for cases where local judges were disqualified. Note, remember that fact. So anyway, with the doctor confessing the VD or testifying with the VD, he thought he had an open and shut case. So on the first day of trial, he brings the doctor in and sets him down on the witness stand, who starts to explain what he knew. And then after about 5 minutes, the presiding judge said, "What are you doing?" And Harrison said, "Well, this is a legitimate witness because I have 2 cases setting precedents for this person." And the judge says, "That's for the state of Montana. This is Lewis and Clark County." Meaning he wasn't even going to consider precedent set for the entire state because you're in Lewis and Clark County now. We do it by our own rules. And so as Harrison put in his memoir, he could see his case slipping out the window. So then the next day, they go and, first they had a recess, and so Harrison called a buddy of his out in Lincoln who was a bachelor that he knew frequented Dorothy's place, who was willing to testify. So he brought him back to the court that same day and testified that, yes, he paid for booze illegally, and yes, he got the services of these women. And Wellington Rankin was the defense attorney on that, and he didn't even want to cross-examine because he was like, "Okay, we're done." Judge gives a $500 fee or fine and calls it good, and then Harrison's like, "Wait," and he brings out the book. It says this particular crime is a $1,000 fine. So again, he's showing that, Lewis and Clark plays by its own rules here. So then on the third day, so that was for just the alcohol portion of the argument. Then the next day, they come back to court to start talking about the abatement, and the judge made an order to close Dorothy's doors. But everybody was called back the next day because somebody had tampered with those orders, and they had to call a retrial. And the judge that had been presiding over it dismissed himself from the case.
Who was it?
I didn't have that information. It's on the court records, I'm sure. And then, a second replacement judge comes in, reads over the testimony, and disqualifies himself. And from my understanding, it's three tries at getting a judge, and on the third one, you're stuck with it. Do you want any guesses as to who was the third judge to preside over that case? The guy in the stack of photos sitting on Harrison's desk. So that's kind of what his whole experience with the red light had been, which may have influenced his opinion of her. Now, I want to get more on that, but I want to talk about first, before I get to that point. So this is the high school picture of Dorothy in the 1933 Great Falls High yearbook. I think she was a junior this year. And as has been written about, she wrote on, I guess it was the owner of the yearbook, on his picture, "Don't tell," some cryptic message about something. Who knows what that meant? So that was a photo of Dorothy. And then the Windbag Saloon had this picture of Dorothy hanging up on the wall. And some people say that's not Dorothy. And I'm going to argue that it is. But it's not the Dorothy Baker who ran the brothel. Apparently they found this photo in Dorothy's residence after it was evaded. And they gave it to the owners of the Windbag, is what my understanding is. So why would Dorothy hold on to this? In my digging and my obsessiveness, 1933 Great Falls newspaper, August, a wedding announcement of a Dorothy Baker. And I don't know about you, but I see some similarities. You got the same kind of part, kind of the same folded over the left eye, a sleepy left eye, kind of same shoulder stance, same square chin. My theory is that this is the same woman, and for some reason, who knows what, maybe Dorothy named herself after her. Was she a rival? Was she somebody she admired? A role model? Or maybe I'm just obsessing on nothing. Then I started I sifted through the DA files, district attorney files available at the Historical Society, and came across this picture of Dorothy Baker. It's her mugshot that they presented in some files for an FBI convention. And as you can see, much closer resemblance. So, and then another thing just that I found interesting, some Cary Grant appearing man in the same file was her longtime boyfriend. His name was Frank Topo Bittrick. He was an amateur fighter, and he had been in and out of every jail on the West Coast for gambling, assault, white slavery, drugs. He was a good egg. And there was a report where he had needle marks up and down his arms for a $1,000 a month narcotics habit that Dorothy supported. Apparently, Dorothy was one to help officers by pointing to drug pushers in the area, but she was known to push her own amount of drugs and do her own amount as well. So that's kind of why I have Dorothy as a complex character. Maybe she didn't have to show her good side so much after people had written her off and she couldn't see an advantage to having to be nice to them anymore. So. Yeah.
Just out of curiosity, how tall was she?
That's a detail I know I have, but I'm not remembering, and I'm very sorry. It might be, yeah, it's in the court records. So, yeah.
What happened to her after they took her out of the house?
She died shortly after. She went back to Great Falls to stay at the hospital up there because she had been sick and she was diabetic and she had the flu. Was it 1 or 2 months after somebody?
She still had access to some money?
That I'm not aware of. I don't know. I just know that she was on quick decline as soon as she was taken away from her environment. So, we are at 40 minutes into this, and I'm only a few slides in. And I want to give people the time to discuss if we want to discuss, or I can keep going, or keep going. Okay, I just don't want people's eyes to glaze over from me just yammering and yammering in a one-way dialogue. Okay.
Something will wake us up.
Okay. Here's another one that I really got a lot of pleasure in researching. How many people know about Beverly Snodgrass? A few people? Well, the reason why I have this picture here is it's not in any real connection to her other than there was a rumor that she dyed her poodles pink. So it was more of a symbolic representation. I'm going to share with you an excerpt on how I started out this chapter. On a chilly October morning in 1968, after handing over her personal documents to the Internal Revenue Service and giving a detailed, up-close personal interview with journalist John Kugelin of the Great Falls Tribune, the infamous Butte madam, Beverly Snodgrass, loaded her pickup camper with her belongings, her Bible, and all 7 of her pet poodles and departed Butte. Her plan? She was headed cross-country to the nation's capital to visit her state senators Mike Mansfield and Lee Metcalf. But she wasn't going because she had taken a sudden interest in politics. Rather, she was intent on soliciting their help in shutting down Butte's notoriously corrupt sex industry from which she was burned out, literally. Literally. According to her accounts, she got tired of paying off the officials. They were milking her. She was getting severe beatings because she was refusing to do the payouts. The match in the powder barrel came after she resolved to stop greasing the palms of corrupt individuals, turning instead toward the Psalms of the good book. This didn't bode too well with the functionaries looking to line their pockets, however. In her interview with the Tribune, Snodgrass declared crooked officials were out to ruin her business with a series of fires that destroyed her property, and she was afraid for her life. So she was born Beulah Maxine Snodgrass. She came from Putney, West Virginia. Is that how you pronounce it? Putney? And she grew up in a large religious family with 2 brothers growing up to work in the ministry. And as she said, I was the one in the family who got off on the wrong track. My parents never knew. So she came to Great Falls first and worked as a waitress at Tracy's, if you're familiar. It's a notorious greasy spoon up there. Had a brief marriage. It didn't work out. She came to Butte and worked again as a waitress and then decided that she wanted to start making a better living for herself, so she's turned to the night trade. And her boyfriend at the time lent her $4,000 to purchase the Windsor, and that was on Wyoming Street. Is that on Wyoming Street? I believe. And this was a 3-story structure. It had 34 rooms. It was already a pre-existing brothel. She was jumping right into the business, and she had made the agreement that she would pay back this loan in 3 years. And then she went to consult with an attorney to see what is the best way to jump through loopholes so that I can keep my business running smoothly without interference from the law. And she got together with James D. Freeborn. And he, of course, said, well, all you got to do is you just pay these monthly fees to some officials, and they'll either look the other way or they'll protect you if necessary. It seemed perfectly fine, nothing nefarious. Standard way of doing business in the red light. So she did as he recommended, and she hired 6 women and made enough profit to open another brothel on Missouri, or the Missouri Rooms, and this was on Mercury Street. Meanwhile, her relationship with Freeborn has flared into this passionate romance where, as reported in the paper, they would go out on the flats at night and enjoy each other's company. And she called him Dimple Knees and Fancy Legs. That's how she referred to him. But over time, she realized that her relations with Freeborn were not so great. He wasn't very nice to her. He started taking some of the payments himself. As the middleman, payments to officials were increasing. And then he started elbowing his way into being a partner with her and wanting to essentially take over the operation. she had claimed that she was paying out so much to city officials, like $75,000 overall, $700 a month. And she couldn't keep up the maintenance on her hotels, so she sold the Windsor and boarded up the Missouri rooms, or maybe the other way around, and then ended up being the victim of several arsons. And she kind of had an idea that Freeborn was behind it. Another rabbit trail, just on a side note, another rabbit trail that I got sidetracked on for a while. There were other important high individuals who I am pretty sure altered documents and misplaced paperwork to protect themselves. And so that's some other future research that I'm going to pursue because it's so interesting. It's my journalism background, and so anyway, she makes these claims, and then I'm just going to close out this. She did John Kuglin did a 7-day series of articles, and he was in the forefront. I don't know if some of you remember him. He was in the forefront of the Freedom of Information Act, set in some of the high standards for Montana on that. Let's see, where am I here? So Snodgrass's story was a series of he said, she said exchanges between respected community leaders, men with honorable jobs and decent families, and a matron of the underworld who happened to have a heavy drinking problem. Whose word would the public be more likely to believe? City officials whom residents voted into office, or some whacked-out whore who was rumored to have dyed her poodles in pastels? If, in fact, Beverly's claims were true, unscrupulous pillars of society were in the prime position to publicly discredit her assertions, writing her off as unstable, punch-drunk, a lunatic with a personal vendetta. They inevitably could pull the necessary strings to distance themselves from their own dirty dealings, covering their tracks and avoiding embarrassment or worse, jail times for charges of corruption. And apparently a whacked-out whore, despite the forces working against her, was able to scrape together and hold on to enough dope to really rattle some folks. Perhaps one of the most startling bits of evidence for Kuglin, is it Kuglin? Kuglin? Okay, I'm saying it right. Personally emerged from after his series of stories ran. One evening he went out for beers with some buddies, and one of Governor Tim Babcock's aides saw him and pulled him aside, saying the governor requested to meet with him. According to Kuglin's account of his meeting with Governor Babcock, the governor warned the reporter of a rumor he heard circulating around. They're going to get you. They're going to come over from Butte and kill you. So subsequently spooked, Kuglin went to bed for a while every night with his gun tucked away under his bed. So.
Is it not true James Freeborn, at the same time this was going on, was a district judge in Butte?
Yes. And I tried so hard to find pictures of him, and I can't find a picture of him. It's making me crazy. So are we needing to stop, or we want to keep going? I'm seeing some yawns. Okay. You asked for it. What's that? That's the reporter. Kuglin is, oh, sorry. Yeah, that's him up there. He was the AP guy for Wyoming and Montana. Bureau chief.
And his son is a reporter with the IR now.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Maybe he has a picture.
Okay. We're going to progress to Great Falls. I just got this picture the other day from Ken Robeson. He was very kind to share it with me here. This is Bea LaMar. She was a notorious madam up in Great Falls. She was married to prize fighter Leo LaMar, who's known as Leo the Kid, or the Kid Leo. And they had the Ozark Club, which was a real prominent jazz music venue that really got some notoriety. They had the likes of like Lionel Hampton and Dinah Washington play there. What's that? Oh, he did? Yeah, I didn't know that. So yeah, it was a hopping place, and it was pretty. First, when it was opened up right after Prohibition, it was African American joint only, and then they eventually opened it up to be available to everyone. And behind the Ozark was a hotel called the LaMar Hotel, out of which Bea ran a brothel. And it was located, let's see, somewhere around 3rd, 5th. They bounced the venues around, and I'm not remembering the address of the final spot. Her business, she called was known as the gravy train of Great Falls. And her motto was, we have it, we sell it, we still got it. Now, according to oral histories collected by a group called the Downtown Chicks, are any of you familiar with them? They're part of the Great Falls Preservation Players. They do some oral history reenactments. Bea treated her employees like royalty as far as that goes. She employed up to a half dozen women at a time. And every Friday, she took them out to the beauty parlor to get their nails and toes done and fix up their hair for looking beautiful for the weekend, partying to be done. She was considered to be classy and distinctive compared to her counterpart, Betty Rogers, who was another madam in town, kind of around the same time, who was known to go shopping wearing only her fur coat with her little dog in tow. And she used an airline bag for a purse. And Betty Rogers was also known to one time get in a scrap with the gentleman visiting her house, and she bit off his finger. And he ran out, and she didn't realize that he was running from the law. He was a wanted man, and then police came by to check on her, and she handed over the finger to give him the fingerprint. But anyway, this is all about Bea, right? Up until the late 50s, she was a pretty respectable madam, and then things started happening to the family that started scarring her reputation. In around 57, they changed the name of the LaMar Hotel to the Doyle Apartments, which later then became the Vista Apartments. There were some abatement actions going against her. The police were trying to shut her down, so they were in the paper a lot, which they tried to avoid generally. She was charged with keeping a house of prostitution and with being a dissolute person who lives on the earnings of women of bad rapport. So she was getting some negative publicity there. They went through some. Then in 1959, they had a son whom they called brother. He was really Leo Jr., but he had a wife, and apparently they had a ruckus. I guess they lived with Bea and Leo, and they got into an argument, and she got shot in the abdomen and ended up dying. It was written off as suicide. The coroner never really investigated further, but that went in the papers, so that was another way that their name was tarnished. The daughter-in-law died. Patricia died. And then a few years later, their son was in a car wreck with 5 friends, and he ended up dying, and there was a woman there was some debate about whether she had stolen some jewelry or not, and ended up being found dead in the car with jewelry tucked away in a private area that she claimed she didn't steal. And then about 3 weeks after, or about a year after their son died, Leo died of a heart attack. And then shortly after that, she got slapped with a tax bill of $100,000 for the venue. So things were just kind of going downhill for her. She stayed working at the Vista Apartments for a while and then ended up moving to Livingston and then Billings. And worked as a home nurse eventually and did a lot of work with the Catholic Church there. How are we doing? Do we need to stretch or anything? Okay. You guys are... Okay. Now we're entering the portion that I just gave up practicing because I was way over my time, so bear with me as I stumble through my notes here. Okay, this is Etta Feely. My perception of her was that she was a real rugged woman. She was spirited, loved animals. She went by the names of Alice Edward, Etta Feely, and Alice Leach, to name some. She worked out of Billings, but she also spent a lot of time in Sheridan and Cody, Wyoming. It appeared from what she was born in Iowa, and she appears to have gotten her start working in Denver, vaudeville scene. There was some description of her wearing erotic clothing, swinging above people watching the shows. And she was fairly popular in the vaudeville circuit, from what I could gather. When she came to Billings, she ended up setting up a roadhouse kind of in the stockyards on the northeast end of town along the railway. And hers was a working man's brothel. It's where cowpunchers, ranchers, laborers came to kind of get their respite at the end of the day. It was a common brothel for common people, unlike the super high-ends. Later, when she opened her brothel in Cody, she went the more lavish route. But in Billings, she was kind of a down-home madam. It was devoid of high-end decor, but customers could be assured they'd get a good meal, plenty of drink, fine music, and freshly changed sheets. The men who sought pleasure there could do so without feeling rushed and herded out the door once the transaction was completed. So it was kind of a casual atmosphere, friendly, come hang out with the family. She was quite the horsewoman. She basically grew up with horses. Later in life, she was known in her 70s or 80s, ridden all the way from Cody to Billings on horseback. This is a picture of her brothel, a sporting house getting torn down in the 65? Yeah, 65. That was in the Park County Archives. When she went to go open her lavish bordello in Cody, she sent out a personal invitation to all the households, addressed only to the men of the households, that says, you are respectfully invited to attend the opening of my new residence at Cody, Wyoming, November 1, 1902. I'm sure that bode well with all the wives in town. She went through several marriages. One in particular, the last one she married was a man by the name of Thomas Leach. He was kind of an enterprising guy. They bought and sold businesses. He opened up, what do you call it, like a scouring, like Comet. There was a mill he started, kind of like a cleanser that I'm sorry, my brain's full. But anyway, he was buying and selling businesses, and they made quite a bit of money doing more in the night trade. And then sometime in the 40s, he up and left with everything and left her destitute. So she moved back to her home here Oh, this is not, I needed to change this caption. This is not Virginia City. This is in Clark, Wyoming. Little one-room stone house where she lived for years. She did go back to Billings for a while. I have a hunch she continued running a brothel remotely sometimes just for income. But eventually a neighbor, she would have the mail woman get her groceries when she didn't want to leave anymore because it was quite an effort for her because she didn't drive. And so the neighbor woman took pity on her and convinced her to move back to Cody, and the Mormon church kind of took her under their wing and rented her a house and subsidized her living expenses. And then the woman gave her a grave plot on her family gravesite. And so that's what I got on Etta Feely. I have one more if you got it in you. Oh, yeah. Okay. Feel free to stand up and stretch if you need to. Okay, Ollie Warren. Ollie Warren was a farm girl from Missouri who spent a lot of time growing up in Colorado. When she was in her teens, her family put her in a convent for schooling. And from what I could gather, she went directly to Denver. Well, the convent was in Denver, but then she continued staying in Denver after she got out of there and had a brief marriage. And then a city directory in 1897 shows up as her living on the Row in Denver, which is the heart of the red light district. So she got a good early start. She went by the names of Anna Dewey. This one was really a fun hunt down. Anna Dewey, Olive Scarrett, Olive Dewey McDaniels, Anna Olive McDaniels, Ollie Warren. So there's a lot of shifting around. She came to Billings and started working for Etta Feely. My guess is that she probably met Etta Feely in Denver, and they met up again. And while she was working for Etta Feely, this was all down by the railroad tracks, from what I could gather, right near the Yegan Brothers Mercantile. So Ollie worked part-time in their dry goods section during the day, and by night. She won the heart of a local lawyer who was married, and he just showered her with attention and gifts. And then I found an interesting story about Calamity Jane. What book doesn't mention Calamity Jane in relation to prostitution? But anyway, Calamity Jane apparently was living on the outskirts of town, collecting wood and selling it to local ranchers and to households for fence posts or for firewood. And apparently one of her clients was a woman she was talking to, and Calamity Jane saw a familiar face walking around this woman's house, and she asked the woman, "Who is that man?" And the woman replied, "That's my husband." And this was the man that Ollie Warren had been cavorting with, the lawyer who was showering her with attention and gifts. So if you've read anything about Calamity Jane, she was a firecracker with a tendency to the drink. And something set her off, and so she stormed over the dry goods store, souped up on her favorite tipple, bearing a hatchet and threatening Ollie Warren with her life. And fortunately, she was probably too inebriated to really do any damage, and another fellow worker pulled her away and escorted her out. But that was enough to tell for Ollie to say, "Enough is enough. I'm done at this place. I'm going to go be a full-time prostitute." No, what happened was her lawyer friend subsidized her brothel business. He helped her get her start, and she became a prominent, she opened the Lucky Diamond, named after apparently a giant diamond that he had gifted her. Let's see, what else? That was in Billings. Yeah, sorry if I wasn't clear on that. One might say she was a little arrogant. She was known to, she was reported to have ridden her carriage through the streets of the wealthy homeowners who were her clientele. She also apparently sent, when her lawyer friend died, she apparently sent the grieving family a giant horseshoe bouquet of roses with a note that said, "Kind regards, love, Olive." Now, one really interesting thing, for some reason I found was really interesting, was that she wasn't always truthful about her age. She was married several times. First time, she married a 34-year-old gentleman by the name of Harvey Doherty. He was 34, and she claimed on her marriage certificate to be 30, when she was actually 37. In a later union, 9 years later actually, she married a man by the name of James McDaniels, who was a sprite young 27-year-old. She liked her younger men, and he maybe liked the idea of being with an older woman, but I don't think he knew how much older she was, because on the marriage certificate it stated she was 34 when actually she was 46. She must have looked really good. So, all right, I think that's all that I have. So, thank you.